Thank you. This is not that easy. Where to begin? How can you introduce Dr. Berger? I asked him the question, and he told me, just be brief, which is typical for Dr. Berger. Dr. Berger has been to our campus several times, so we've been quite lucky the last couple of years to have him here on campus for several occasions. We had him as a speaker. I had the opportunity to have discussions with him based on some of his books and talking about how his views as a sociologist of religion have changed over the years. And Professor Berger is Professor Emeritus at Boston University, and I guess we can safely say the most important sociologist of religion of the 20th and also the 21st century. So next month, Dr. Berger will be in Austria, where there will be a conference on 50 years of his book that he wrote with Thomas Luckmann 50 years ago, The Social Construction of Reality, a book that everybody should know, an extremely influential book. And Professor Berger will be in Vienna for this conference, but also to receive the highest award of the state of Austria. So this is a real pleasure to have him here on our campus, and we're really honored to have you here. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you for the people who've invited me here. This project, I'm honored to be drawn in right here at Gordon College campus with those of you that are here. I am proud of my brother who has been here and makes me happy to come, and a niece who's studying here now, so I feel quite at home. I have another connection with Gordon College, but it wouldn't have been mentioned because it occurred long before most of you were born, and after long before memories faded. I taught here for 3 years in the 70s. So in any case, I feel quite comfortable here and with lots of friends. It's an honor to be able to give some response. We have just 10 minutes apiece, we're told, to Peter Berger's paper that he presented. And I wish I could say more about that, and that will come, and he's already been adequately introduced. A little bit of awkwardness, I feel, is that the remarks I've made kind of follow from the paper, and since he's not giving that paper, then you don't necessarily know what's in it, but I've tried to tailor these so that you'll get the drift of what I'm responding to. The other thing is that I kind of like to address him, but I'm addressing an audience, so you'll have to put all those things together. Peter Berger, in taking distance, as he does, from the secularization theory. The thesis of his paper is the secularization theory is failed, it's inadequate, and he wants to replace it with a theory of pluralism. In doing that, he makes the empirical statement that religion has not died away, as secularization theory had projected or expected. And then he states that a pluralist theory, which he wants to displace it or replace it, must take into account not only a diversity of religious discourses, that's not the only pluralism, but the diversity of religious and secular discourses. So it's an added complexity of pluralism. In that connection, he then introduces a distinction between secularism and secularity. Secularism he describes as a philosophical worldview or political ideology that either rejects religion as a whole or wants religion kept out of the public arena for the sake of civic peace. Two streams or two sides, possibilities of secularism. Secularity, by contrast, he says, is simply a word that describes the fact that there are areas of life that are handled without reference to religion. Kind of an empirical description of a fact that that's the way it is. Now, Dr. Berger, you apparently reject the ideology of secularism, at least in that first strong sense, which rejects religion as a whole. However, your paper in its entirety appears to me to be fully in tune with secularism in the second sense, of wanting to keep religion out of the public square for the sake of civic peace. I say this because your argument that comes through later or through the paper that Christians should accept secularity. We should not have difficulty accepting that there are these areas that are handled without reference to religion. That Christians ought to accept that for the sake of civic peace fits perfectly with his definition of secularism in that second sense, keeping religion out of the public square. So I'm led to the conclusion that Dr. Berger holds a secularist view of what he calls secular spaces, meaning that religions, including Christianity, belong in a confined area or a relatively defined area of worship, doctrinal beliefs, and theological discourse. And this is fully in keeping with his approval of the moderate convictions, Christian convictions of Hugo Grotius, whom he cites in his paper, who said, Hugo Grotius, the father of international law and many other things, but that's what he's most known for. Grotius, who believed that the new discipline of international law should be developed as if God did not exist. In other words, without any religious presuppositions. That statement also seems to conform almost entirely to the original secularization theory that he wants to replace with a theory of pluralism. In his new theory, it appears that you simply want to avoid the empirical error made by the secularization theorists of failing to recognize the continuing liveliness of religions. You want to recognize the continuing liveliness of religions. It's an empirical fact that it's there, but the secularization hypothesis is that that will be marginalized and gradually people will be living in a modern, rational way in secular life. I also take it from your theological reflections, these are all brief and compact that he offers, that your hope is that moderate Christians and people of other faiths will accept the confinement of religion to the private margins of social life, thus contributing to the peaceful success of the secularization hypothesis. Now, this is the juncture at which his dismissal of fundamentalism comes in, or his worry about fundamentalism. And if I read you rightly, Peter, you're not suggesting that fundamentalists of whatever stripe and whatever they are you're not suggesting that they should be denied the right to hold beliefs, but that those who continue to try to impose their beliefs in public life, in other words, make them forceful or applicable in the secular spaces, are what he's calling fundamentalists. So it has a social activist meaning and not just a kind of a doctrinal meaning of fundamentalism. But at that point, this question comes to me: what's the difference between secularism, even in its more moderate form, being imposed in public spaces? What's the difference between that and Christianity or nationalism or communism or Islam being imposed? The implied theological judgment of the paper is that Christians should reject fundamentalism and accept the secularity of public spaces. And that sounds to me like an affirmation of your secularist preference rather than a reasoned judgment arising from a comprehensive theory of pluralism and thorough, comprehensive theological reflection. And that leads me to the following hypothesis about your concern with fundamentalism. Is it not the case that your preference for treating secular spaces without reference to religion is really a plea for all religions to accept the kind of political governmental system that upholds religious freedom? If so, then there's a gap in your paper, in my reading, because you do not offer a sociological or theological account of the origins and norms of that kind of political system. That kind of constitutional government-limited system did not just come out of nowhere. It doesn't just exist as a fact. It arose from something. It has a history, and it's unlike a bunch of other systems. How did it get there? What does it take to hold it? So if you and I, as Christians, want a political system in which government's power is limited and in which religious freedom for all is protected as a matter of constitutional principle, then don't we need to give an account of how that kind of constitutional system arose and offer a Christian rationale for why Christians and others ought to accept and promote it? I believe we should do that, and that is where a variety of normative judgments about human identity, public justice, and a diversified pluralistic society have to be made in conjunction with a careful empirical assessment of historically developing social reality. And none of this, it seems to me, can be done without religious presuppositions. It cannot be done without reference to religion or religiously equivalent basic assumptions and commitments. And this is also to say that I don't think religion can be confined to theological discourse, worship, and doctrines, because most religions entail a way of life and not only a way of worship. A way of life that is comprehensive in its direction and not simply something that can be put in one side apart from secular space. Apart from that, it seems to me that your theological reflection and sociological theory of pluralism will remain dialectically dualistic. By that I mean the two poles that you seem to operate with, of religion and the secular, of private faith and public religionlessness, will continue to be oppositional, defined as opposites or exclusive, and at the same time interdependent. It's like the North and South Pole. The one is not the other. They're oppositional, but they're interdependent. And what I'm looking for, Dr. Berger, is where's the globe? Where's that whole thing of which those two poles are apart? Thank you.
All right. Well, let me open by thanking Professor Berger for his paper, and in particular for his concern that we recognize the advantages that pluralism brings, as well as the challenges that it offers. These sorts of discussions on the nature of pluralism are familiar to many of us, and it is a delight to be able to receive this new articulation. What I would like to consider with all of you briefly is what is required for politics in particular to be possible in plural societies. As Professor Berger notes in his paper, this challenge is not a new one. Indeed, the reigning political philosophy today, which is political liberalism, grew up in the 17th and 18th centuries partly in response to a situation which is very much like our own. That is, the fragmentation of Europe that accompanied the wars of religion. Obviously, those religious wars posed a very practical problem for politics. How are we going to govern people who are so willing to kill each other over matters of religion? But they also posed a tremendous theoretical question for politics. When people disagree on so much that is important, upon what can we establish the authority of the state? With what can we persuade people to obey? What will give the state legitimacy? Now, in the early modern era, the figure of Thomas Hobbes looms large. Hobbes is significant not merely for accommodating religious conflict within the framework of a nation state, but more than that, he initiated a philosophical response to the challenge of pluralism more broadly. A response that still is our default response today. And it also, broadly understood, is the path taken by Professor Berger in his paper. Now, what was that path? Well, Hobbes and the other early liberals set about finding foundations for the state that were independent of theology, or, in Professor Berger's language, were without religious presuppositions. Faced with a situation of radical religious plurality, early liberals sought to establish political order on whatever else people might hold in common, and thereby ensure a framework in which widespread agreement on some commonness might enable those who disagree about so much to live together within the same society. I see Hobbes as significant as one of the earliest attempts to do this, and Professor Berger cites Grotius as accomplishing something similar. Now, I'm not suggesting that such approaches are unreasonable. From the time of the ancient Greeks onward, a widespread consensus on matters of morality and identity was seen to provide a stable foundation for political society. And given the breakdown in this consensus and its frightful consequences for politics, the search for a new consensus was a natural step. This new foundation was to be non-controversial, it was to be reliable and uniform, true for everyone, regardless of the differences of belief or other differences in identity. Now today, it seems to me that we, late moderns, are involved in efforts that are similar to those of the early moderns. I call it the politics of abstraction. Faced with disagreement, we seek to abstract from our pluralism in search of a foundation, or as Professor Berger puts it, for a secular space that is somehow independent of any and all religious views, and similarly independent of other pluralisms that might threaten our political stability. In other words, we, like Hobbes, are engaged in the project of finding an alternative new foundation for our politics. The problem is, we're having difficulty finding a foundation that works. The chief difficulty is that any basis of authority which is robust enough to do the work that is required is bound to be controversial and in fact privileges certain groups or perspectives over others. So in the concern to establish the foundations for political order on something other than religion or in any other controversial moral doctrine, we search for some even lower common denominator that can somehow unite the population. Freedom, reason, nature, contract, secularity, these have all been candidates. And once the foundation is articulated and established, then any difference, cultural, religious, racial, and so on, any difference can be tolerated so long as it does not violate the commonality that undergirds the regime. Now, what is being overlooked is that to pursue such a strategy of tolerance is actually to relegate vital aspects of human identity to the realm of public indifference. They're trivialized or recast as mere preferences. At the same time, however, the various candidates proposed for this new common basis are becoming ever more abstract and ever more thin with each passing identity crisis. They're becoming so thin, in fact, that we may be approaching the limits of this strategy, which of course only underlines the fact that we indeed need a theory of pluralism. So, what's the suggestion? Well, my proposed alternative is that we try to pry open the doors for approaches to politics that are less concerned with consensus and its achievement, and more concerned to actually emphasize the importance of plurality in our social life. So here's the challenge. All of us, not just liberals, and not just religious people, not just them, but also us, also Professor Berger, we have to put aside the assumption that we're looking for a politics of a community with a shared moral perspective. Perhaps such a view made sense during the era of Christendom. Perhaps it made sense for Grotius and for Hobbes, who sought a new unity once Christendom had been shattered. Perhaps it made sense in the years and the decades before Professor Berger took aim at secularization theory. But if it ever made sense then, it does not make sense now. Now, what might this look like? Well, we might begin by asking a favorite question of Christian poli-sci professors. You're driving in the middle of the night, and you come across a deserted intersection. The light is red. and there are no police officers around. You can run the light with no consequences. What do you do? Well, we can offer all sorts of different answers to that question, and they reveal a great deal about what people believe concerning the authority of the law. And surely we want more than might makes right. But in a democratic, genuinely pluralist state, it seems inappropriate to assert the nation's dependence on God, for example. It seems similarly inappropriate to emphasize, say, popular will. And I'm afraid that a declaration that the rule comes from a secular, religiously neutral space that pluralism opens up, that's not going to cut it either. Here's another thought. Do we really need to have a public, secular answer to the question I just asked? Is it necessary that in this debate, that one of the proponents be found right? That one of those arguments actually win? Or could we say that in a pluralist society, all of them are right? Now, philosophically and theologically, that is not true, because the various answers are mutually exclusive. But politically, I don't think we need to say so. And our silence on this point offers us a big advantage. We don't need to rule against people coming into our shared spaces because of the grounds of their views or agreements or arguments. And we also avoid asking citizens to downplay their particular identities or require them to make distinctions between their core and their periphery beliefs. Requirements that, as I just said a few minutes ago, tend to relegate these identities and the people who hold them to the realm of public indifference. Now, what I'm suggesting does require that we revise how we understand what a shared political space actually is. Rather than insisting on a moral consensus, we're only working for an agreement to share space. We agree on some sort of constitution for that space, but we don't agree why. When we ask why, well, that's when the legitimate disagreement begins. Adopting this posture means loosening control, removing ourselves from the gatekeeping function that perhaps we thought we had, or perhaps we were seeking. And we may find, in fact, that the reasons people hold to the principles and procedures of our political space may vary as much as the people do themselves. And I will be honest to say that this looks really risky. In this model of consensus, everyone is disestablished. Not only the church or Christianity, but also liberalism, nationalism, even secularism. And it works only if all of these can recognize that a genuine theory of pluralism requires that Christianity, liberalism, nationalism, and secular spaces all be denied pride of place. What we are describing here is a theory of politics that does not even pretend to operate within the confines, as well as the security, of a society-wide, deep moral consensus. Is this too risky? Well, perhaps, but only if we hold to the view that says that what most fundamentally holds us together is an ideological or religious or secular agreement among citizens concerning the nature of our society. If that belief is true, then the extent of our pluralism really is alarming, and the risk is that much greater. On the other hand, the truth of that statement is not obvious, and it's certainly not necessary. Here's one alternative. A basic guarantee of equal opportunity of democratic participation is more important than a prior agreement concerning the character or the nature of that participation. What else is a polity, we might ask, than a structure which embraces all who reside in a territory, regardless of their race, their religion, their gender, ethnicity, and all the other distinctions that divide? And if the state embraces all, without regard to particularities, then our theory of pluralism should emphasize enabling all to participate, without regard to these particularities, and especially without an insistence that participation follow the rules of an imposed secularity. Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to be here and able to join this august panel of scholars and to be able to respond to Peter Berger. I would say that my work is more of an interpretation and an application of his work than a critique per se. My paper is entitled Evangelical Christianity and Women's Roles in Contemporary Brazil, Marginalization or Modernization. As Berger asserts, the world is becoming more religious, not less, and more women in the developing world are converting to or remaining within religions rather than becoming secularized. In Brazil, a number of women, along with men, have converted to evangelicalism, particularly Pentecostalism. Over 1/5 of the population is evangelical and 2/3 of them Pentecostal. Studying evangelical women in Brazil, in my research I explore the political, social, church, and familial implications of their faith, as well as implications for navigating the modern pluralistic age. In particular, as part of a Templeton project at Gordon focused on evangelicalism and modernizing cultures, Brazil and China, I traveled to Sao Paulo and Maringá, Brazil, headed by Kay Cook and along with Sharon Ketchum, interviewing a number of evangelical women leaders and leaders-to-be on these questions. As Berger contends, do they distinguish between what is core and non-negotiable to their faith and what is peripheral in their engagement in this increasingly pluralist context? And how does gender affect that compromise? How do they navigate moving from, as Berger puts it, fate to choice? Already, to become evangelical, and in particular Pentecostal, many women undertake what Bernice Martin calls the Pentecostal gender bargain. It can enable women some betterment, alternative forms of leadership, domesticated spouses, but at the cost of submission to ongoing forms of patriarchy within the church and their families. So my work then explores how increased religiosity of women and the modern pluralist age respectively helps women resist or further entrenches traditional gender divisions within families, the church, and the public sphere. So along with my colleagues, we engaged in semi-structured individual and group interviews with multiple women in Sao Paulo and Maringá, speaking with 5 women seminarians and a theology professor in Sao Paulo at the university there, with a sociologist, a journalist, 9 women seminarians at Unicesumar in Maringá, a university there, and a politician, a Sao Paulo City Councilwoman Bezerra, and her husband also a Sao Paulo state representative. And the interviews were ably translated by Nama Mendez, an alum of Gordon. So first, what are the familial implications of evangelicalism and gender in Brazil today? Does evangelicalism help women resist marginalization, enable the reformation of machismo, as Elizabeth Brusco and Cecilia Loreto Merez attest, help women moving from fate to choice, a la Berger? Well, sociologist Claudine told us that women pastors in top positions experience dilemmas with the lack of childcare, lack of help in the home, which is common to Brazilian women. But because of their status, they are able to negotiate with their husbands to pursue things outside of marriage and be more autonomous, enabling more mobility, sometimes reaching down to bring other women up and free them as well. The Bezerras, Carlos and Patricia, politicians, both have the experience of being professionals, ministers, politicians, and they both parent their children, both fulfilling their calls in the public and private spheres. And as for women's role within the home and the pursuit of careers, at the university in Maringá, only 1 of the 9 female seminarians called herself a complementarian. Bruna said she'd need to be married to serve in the church. If someone called me to a certain area, I wouldn't accept. I would wait on God to have someone accompany me. Seminarian Alexandra said she sees a lot of resistance in her church and in her society with women being at the same level as men, women historically really being pushed to be at home, especially amongst the poorest classes. But after studying the scriptures, she came to see that women have a fundamental role in ministry and in all positions. All 9 women affirmed that they felt called by the Holy Spirit to study theology. On the whole, women see some greater sharing of the domestic sphere by sexes, though still they struggle with machismo. Seminary women interviewed were being bold to enter new territories with or without spouses, moving from fate to choice, but there's more work to be done in exploring this. Few raised this independently as an obstacle or highlighted major positive transformation. And what of the church experience for evangelical women? Are women reduced to presumptions that women pastors or women in leadership in churches tend to be more spiritual, while men tend to be more theologically gifted, as Neen Lacau and others have found amongst Protestants in China? Politician Patricia Becerra is part of an independent neo-Pentecostal church, and although she's frustrated with ongoing limits for women in her church, she notes that women can not only pray, but actually preach, and she herself being an ordained minister. Of the theology students at the University of Moringa, 8 of the 9 women want to go on for masters or doctorates, and most were in denominations where women could now be ordained, and only 1 was outspoken against women's ordination. Bruna, again, said she disagreed with most of the class and felt that women have a traditional role to take care of the family and be supportive. Christiana there has a female head pastor who encouraged her to attend seminary and financially supports her training. As she told us, "I think things are changing. In the past, women couldn't do anything, and now they can do everything. Pastor, pray, serve in all ministries. They're leaders." Another woman remarked that although there's still a lot of machismo in the church and in society, God is raising up women and men to preach. In the Sao Paulo Seminary, Adriana said, "Ordaining females is maybe a controversy of the past. Today, the controversy is LGBT issues and how to deal with that in an appropriate manner." Her female professor disagreed that female ordination is settled and sees the seminary at the forefront of the movement to promote gender equality. Another seminarian, Giselle, there said, "The difficulty for the church is to accept both pastors as having equal say in the leadership of the church when there are husband-wife pastoral teams. Usually the female pastor becomes the auxiliary pastor, and a lot are not paid for their services." 2 seminarians who came from northeast Brazil noted how much more traditional it is for women in that region. As Danielle highlighted, "In my church, there are no female elders, and so I see that if I'm here today, it's because God desired for it to be so." The opportunity for women to lead exists within these churches, but women are not always out in front. Sometimes they are able to overcome those barriers based on family connections, according to sociologist Clauderine, and there is a trend among these denominations toward the ordination of women overall, but women pastors are still seen as having more spiritual functions, prayer, prophecy, and healing, rather than theological or teaching ones. And what of women's roles within the public sphere? Are women moving beyond personal to social and political transformation, or is this too optimistic a read? Again, see the work of Paul Freston, Peter Berger, and Robert Hefner in terms of some skepticism here. But journalist Marilia highlighted that the evangelical church in Brazil is available. Churches are everywhere. They're open all the time with people available during the week for services, Bible studies, literacy classes, after-school programs, etc. They offer personal interests, not just abstract political ideas. And there's more pastoral intervention available in contrast with the work of the Catholic Church. She pointed to the literacy efforts of her church and the important role of the church in helping to fill in where government schools are failing. This is particularly important given that those in the lowest classes often cannot afford private education. The church can fulfill desperate societal need to provide after-school programming and alternatives for children after school so they're not caught up in violence on the streets. Adriana at the Sao Paulo Seminary noted that she feels called to ministry and for the particular job of bringing the church into the community through the NGO in which she works within a large favela. She believes that what really matters is the inclusion of the church in society, so being able to keep up with society and addressing that in a meaningful manner. Danielle noted that in her city, she does not see any state organization or non-governmental organization working with adolescents and females that have just left the prison system, a lack that the church can and is responding to, offering care for some of the most vulnerable women in her city. Patricia Becerra, the politician, focuses her political work on women, given considerable discrimination against women that remains in that society, fighting violence against women, supporting women's right to breastfeed in public, and poor women's rights to have anesthesia during childbirth. Marilia, the journalist and biographer of presidential candidate Marina Silva, says Silva is an example of this as well. She sees Silva's faith as related to her political engagement. Silva believes that since God is creator of the world, it's our responsibility to care for God's creation. But Silva gets accused of being a fundamentalist for turning to faith in addition to science, even if she doesn't support a 7-day creation. To echo what Jim Skillen and Paul Brink have said here, Silva doesn't secularize or neutralize her faith in order to be a politician in a pluralistic society, even though she's been chastised for it. It's clearly an animating driving force for her engagement. Overall, however, journalist Marilia worried that evangelicals were often quite naive and therefore easily influenced by conservative evangelical politicians in Brazil, the Bancada Evangélica, on issues of abortion, marriage, and even engagement on corruption. At the university in Moringa, seminary women on the whole felt that these shifts overall for women in the church and in society would result in women being more engaged politically. One seminarian said, "Women can help clean up society because we're mothers. Care for others is closer to us. It's part of who we are," echoing maternal feminist language. Many women see society, even politics, as a mission field inspired and affirmed by churches and the Holy Spirit to do so, to lead in all squares, to fill in the gaps. But they are worried about evangelicals' political reputation, and particularly that of the Evangelical Bancada, and its focus on marriage and life issues to the neglect of poverty concerns and its implication in corruption scandals. Overall, what is the modern pluralistic Brazilian society like for women? How does the church help women navigate it, and does modernity itself help these women move forward? Marilia, the journalist, argues that modernity is slow in moving this along amongst evangelicals, as the majority are still Pentecostals and Baptists, who, she says, are still a long way from holding their women as equally empowered with their male counterparts. As Alexandra in the Moringa seminary remarked, in her church, her pastor says, "You're a missionary wherever you are, your job, your family, with the people around you." Her pastor also promotes more intimacy with God, and that being so, if you're intimate with the Lord, you'll be able to walk in the Spirit. That deep personal transformation necessarily leads to social transformation in her estimation. This speaks to Bernice Martin's point of the agency that evangelicalism can offer to mobilize populations, perhaps women in particular, in the modern world. As for agency, secular sociologist Claudine stated, "Non-Christian feminism in Brazil is often built by rich white women in ivory tower universities, so there's not real efficacy to it. Christian feminism is more involved in civil society and has real praxis." As well, she argues, feminist scholars don't tend to do well with issues of marriage or maternity and fail to address them. While in the churches, lack of maternity may be a problem for female pastors, but if women manage it well, women in the church can use marriage and motherhood to support their rise. As Bernice and David Martin attest, evangelicalism, and Pentecostalism in particular, seems more modernizing than not on the whole, and for women as well, even if the paths for women and men differ. The church is still best positioned to make key changes for women over and above elite feminist organizations with little reach or access to the majority of the population. What is key is what the church is actually doing with that access.
Well, it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. Dan said that I'm coming back, but technically I haven't left for Valparaiso University, so I'm still here, but traveling out there. Some mystics in the early modern period were believed to have had the gift of bilocation, and that's kind of what I'm trying to be in two places at the same time. But it's especially nice to be here with Dr. Berger as the director of the Jerusalem and Athens Forum and the Center for Faith and Inquiry. We've hosted him a number of times over the years, and it's always engaging and a learning experience. And out of all the speakers that we've hosted, I can say, hands down, he has the best sense of humor and is the funniest. So if you don't hear a few jokes before this is over, you should ask for your money back. Not to put him on the spot or anything. My remarks are sort of going to take the form of what I did on my summer vacation. And when I was asked to do this, I said, I really, not an expert in religious pluralism, but I am going to India on this was a faculty development trip sponsored by a center at Calvin College called the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity. And they have this wonderful model of taking 10 American scholars and 10, whatever the host country is. In our case, it was not only scholars, but activists and journalists, and have them travel throughout the country and think about a particular issue together, meet in seminars, go to certain on-site locations. But our theme was religion and religion's role in economic and social development, and this was a very new experience for me. So my remarks are also not contaminated by expertise as well. So if you know more about India than I do, later on you can make yourself heard. I just want to just mention some key learnings from this trip, which are not at all unrelated to the question of religious pluralism, and then pose a couple of questions to Dr. Berger. First of all, it says India, it's to quote Augustine, a hissing cauldron of religious pluralism, and a very religious place. It's a whole subcontinent that bears witness to the validity of Berger's repudiation of the secularization thesis. It's majority Hindus, most of you probably know, but a very large Muslim minority, small Christian minority, Buddhist, Zoroastrians, Jews, secularists, and I could go on and on. So it's, secularism is, very, it just has a very minute status among the population as a whole. Christianity, one of the real learnings for me was to see how Christianity looks as a minority religion. It's roughly only 2 to 3% of the whole population of India are Christians, but it embodies a very deep Christian history. Some of the earliest Christians quite possibly could have been from the missions of the Apostle Thomas to India. And then later Christians, Syriac-speaking Christians, they still preserve Syriac language and liturgy, and especially in southern India. Actually, some of you might know Katie Gilbert, a former student of mine, just received a Fulbright to go study Syriac Christianity in India. But then later, with the Portuguese Empire, you had Roman Catholics coming over and setting up missions in Goa and in other places, and spreading out from there. Of course, with the Raj, the British Empire, well, actually I missed a step. The German pietists, so Lutherans of pietist orientations, set up one of really the first Protestant missions in all of Protestant history in Tranquebar in the south. And then later you have Anglicans, and in the 20th century you have about every possible flavor of Christian there, evangelicals, holiness background, Methodists, Presbyterians, Mormons. So even though it has a minority status, it's a very diverse minority. It does have, since its founding, many of you know that India is the largest democracy in the world, and so it's the largest democracy that seeks, at least in its constitution, to protect religious pluralism and freedom. Article 25 of its constitution, that dates from 1950, reads, quote, "All persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right to freely to profess, practice, and propagate religion." So that's the good news. The more problematic news, and really one of the key things I learned on the trip, was just about the ideology of Hindutva, which might be translated as Hindu-ness. On the subcontinent there is, from time immemorial, just a very complex, diverse religious systems that Westerners tried to corral it all into something called Hinduism. And that's existed from time immemorial. But Hindutva is it's a modern phenomenon. It does, draw its ideological energy from Hinduism, understood as a culture or as a religion, but it kind of marries it with Western nationalism, and some of the early figures in the movement of Hindutva quite literally drew from the European experience in the 19th and 20th century. So it goes back earlier. It came on the scene in a dramatic way in 1948 when Gandhi was assassinated. The assassin comes out of this Hindutva background, and he did not like Gandhi's notion of sort of a pluralistic, peaceful society where Hindus and Muslims and other minorities could live together, but he thought really just that there should be a Pakistan, a pure Muslim country, there should be a pure Hindu company. So it really kind of fell in sort of a cloud of disapprobation for a period, but really the story of the latter part of the 20th century is it's kind of gaining legitimacy in many institutions. Especially there's this one, it embodies a whole network of organizations throughout India. Probably one of the best known is the RSS, which might be defined as a National Volunteer Society. I described it in my paper as it's part Boy Scouts, part religious order, and part paramilitary institution into one that really tries to propagate the ideology of Hindutva. In this ideology, it's limited time, so I can't say that much about it, but it sort of understands Jains and Buddhists to be kind of part of the Indian family tree. But those that have come from outside, especially Muslims and Christians, really targets, and there has been in the past several decades, a real escalation of religious violence against Muslims and against Christians. I think this is not that well known in the West, and many of my colleagues on the Indian side really rued this fact because we're so preoccupied with Islamic extremism, and rightly so to a degree, that we don't really take a look at what's happening on the Indian subcontinent. So there have been a number of riots, really just atrocious things going on, raping of nuns, burning of Christian homes and churches. And I detail a few things that I learned about in the paper. And we actually visited one burned out church in New Delhi. We were primarily in the south, in Bangalore and Chennai, and then we spent a week in New Delhi. But this is the ideological background of the Prime Minister today, Narendra Modi. He comes out of this. He was actually higher up in the RSS. His political party, the BJP, which we might translate as the India's People Party. I mean, it's sort of the more legitimate political aspect of this, but many of its movers and shakers have deep roots in Hindutva, and often the violence takes place sort of at the lower level among some of the rank and file, but one of the real problems that critics have pointed out, including some that were the Indians on our trip, is that there's sort of a climate of impunity, that many things are just not investigated. Government, local government, and state government sometimes sort of look the other way, and there have been many calls, including from President Obama, who visited in January of 2015, that the government at the highest level really need to call a spade and recognize and deal with this more forthrightly. Let me just say switch gears, and one other thing that I'm beginning to work on a book on interreligious dialogue, or the history of interfaith and interreligious dialogue. There's been a lot of it in the 20th century, but there's no really global history of it. It's sort of been taking place here and there. There's some institutional histories of particular organizations, but arguably you could say that India began formal interfaith dialogue by this one emperor, Akbar, who was actually a Muslim emperor. Before the British period, there was what's called the Mughal dynasty that goes back from the 1500s all the way up into 1857, when the British government sort of formally begins to set up shop as an empire in India. And Emperor Akbar is sort of a pivotal figure in the history of interreligious dialogue because he quite deliberately would different Hindus and Muslims. He would have Jesuit missionaries coming up from Goa, Jains and others, and try to figure out what is the truth of religion. And in some ways that was a savvy imperial policy, because he's the emperor of all this hissing cauldron of different religions, but it's an interesting question. What is the truth of religion? And he called different scribes and scholars to debate the question. So that was another. We actually visited some places important for the Mughal empire and had a chance to read up on Akbar, who at least maybe would figure in the preface of the book that I hope maybe one day to write. But let me just wrap up with two questions to Dr. Berger. How do we understand Hindutva? What's the right sociological category? In some ways, they do seem to be fundamentalists, but they're also very modern as well. I mean, it's a nationalist ideology. Their economic policy, at least in the BJP, is often kind of very pro-growth, and that's why like the Wall Street Journal editorialists tend to like some things that are going on today. So it seems to be sort of a strange melange of kind of religious nostalgia, nationalism, what the scholar Benedict Anderson famously described as an imagined community, a community that really didn't exist in the past, but you hoped it does, and you hope to kind of recreate it in the present. So if it's not fundamentalism, what is the right sociological category to describe a religio-political movement with great force? I mean, arguably, just in terms of sheer numbers, this is the largest nationalist movement in the world right now. And then finally, what is the role of interfaith or interreligious dialogue in sort of keeping an open pluralist society? And that's a question I've begun to think about. And I know Dr. Berger has participated in many interfaith type dialogues. My worry is that it sort of often brings together the sort of the liberal ends of all the traditions in sort of a self-congratulatory moment. Aren't we unlike all the hicks and the real fanatics in our tradition? But it doesn't really do much. It's more of kind of just sort of an academic cordon off into a congratulatory academic space. So what then, but I think it's important nonetheless. I don't want to poo-poo it on those grounds. I guess my question is, what does it take to have an ethic of interreligious dialogue that would really spread to sort of the center, to use political language, and the right of various religious spectrums that would engage more people than just sort of a liberal academic elite. So I'll stop there, and again, it's great to be here with you.
All right, thank you very much for your very thought-provoking contributions. And we want to ask Professor Berger now to respond to the 4 papers.
Well, Gregor, thank you very much, and for your generous introduction. When I'm so generously introduced, I think I've said this to you before, I always think of, first of all, to say thank you, and then I feel like sort of shuffling and saying, what, poor little me, exaggerate. But then I remember Golda Meir, the late Prime Minister of Israel, apparently said to some of her, one of her ministers, don't be so humble, you're not that important. But thank you anyway. Look, I've asked myself, what can I usefully say? I've listened to, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4 papers, only 2 of which I've read before, and I'm reluctant to, I've read Professor Howard's and Professor Skillen's papers, but not the other 2. So I'm reluctant to comment on comments that I haven't, papers I haven't read. What can I usefully do? First of all, you should know, this is my relationship with this institution ends with the semester. The production of this book will take much longer than this semester. I will have nothing to do with it. You should know that. This is my last gig at Gordon College. Any of you where we meet perhaps in the future, in this world or some other world, this world is conceivable. I live in Boston. The other world depends on your theology. I'm a very open-minded Lutheran, and I'm willing to accept all kinds of people in the next world, but maybe some of you don't. Anyway, what can I usefully say? Let me first say just a couple of words about the papers I have not read. With the paper on whether, how did you phrase it, your paper, whether a society requires a moral consensus, I disagree with you. I think it does. And it becomes very clear when you confront things which are totally against your own beliefs, and you have to find allies. Very, very lively problem today in much of the world in the confrontation with Islam, with radical Islam, Sharia-type Islam. On the other papers, on the Women in Brazil paper, well, actually, the 2 other countries that were talked about, Brazil and India, are very interesting, because Brazil is now very, as you very rightly said, a very cosmopolitan and pluralistic society. And they are doing, the Catholics have changed their attitude from being deadly afraid of the Protestants and now saying, no, we're all brothers in Christ, which I think is an improvement. And since we're dealing with Christian denominations, I think the problem of finding a moral consensus is not that difficult as between, I don't know, ISIS and Presbyterianism. India is, of course, a tremendously pluralistic country and is a democracy. And I think what's happening in India is very interesting. I follow it rather closely. It's my job as a sociologist of religion to follow closely what happens all over the world. And Mr. Modi, who seems to be an admirable man in some ways, except not so much when he ran the state of Gujarat and more or less presided over a big pogrom of Muslims. But he seems to want to get away from his past, and he faces an interesting problem. What does Hindutva mean? And I will come to that back in a moment, what it may mean, what it may not mean, not have you too impatient for my conclusion. It's the same question. Is Hindutva relationship to Indian democracy the same as the C parties in Germany to the Constitution of the Federal Republic? There are 2 parties in Germany, both in the government, who call themselves Christian, the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union. We're now in a big fight over the immigration issue. But they both want to be, what does it mean to be Christian? And does Hindutva mean what it means to be Christian, to the Christian Social Union, Christian Democratic Union in Germany, or does it mean a kind of Sharia? And both are possible. Mr. Modi, I think, faces a very interesting problem. Maybe you can advise him. It would be a very useful function. Which course to take? I will say a couple things about, I don't think I'm going to say much more about India. This is, if I had more time, that's what I would do, is to discuss how does Hindutva compare to Angela Merkel's Christianity. Very interesting. Merkel and Christianity and Modi and Hindutva. I want to focus particularly on your paper. And I'm not trying to make an invidious comparison. Obviously, all the people here who spoke have very interesting things to say, and I think are highly competent. I wish I had more time. But your paper is a direct criticism of mine, which is always welcome. People who agree with me, I agree with myself. But people who disagree with me, at least in a non-hostile, amicable way, is more interesting. And you challenge directly, and in a very interesting way, my concept of a secular space. Let me first defend the concept, and then, particularly with reference to Brazil and India, get back to my example from German politics. So I think there's lots to be learned from. Secular space. Look, what's quite relevant here, I'm a Lutheran, not in a dogmatic way. There are things about Lutheranism I have my questions about, including rather unfortunate episodes in Luther's own life toward the end of his life, when he turned out to be quite an objectionable character politically. But I believe in the doctrine of the two kingdoms, and that makes a lot of difference. And there's a sharp difference from much of Christianity that derives from Calvinism, but also from Roman Catholicism, which until at least the Second Vatican Council believed in Catholic state religions. Now they don't anymore. Huge progress, I think. What is a secular space? I chose the wrong example, I think. You mentioned it to me. I don't think you didn't mention it today, but when you talked before, you mentioned it. One example I gave in my book, and I think it's in the article, I don't remember now, is the Pope in his Pope-mobile. The Pope, the Pope-mobile, which looks suspiciously like a golf cart. And the Pope, Francis Pope, whom I like, seems to be a very nice man. And he uses that Pope-mobile to go through the vast spaces of Vatican City, which is about as big as an independent state represented at the United Nations, about as big as Central Park. And let's imagine he steps into that Pope-mobile, and he goes to a religious ceremony proclaiming that somebody is a saint. Some, let's say, maybe Brazilian nun is now a saint, which really extends the jurisdiction of the papacy to the next world, which is interesting. Very supernatural trip, but the damn, excuse the adjective, the damn Pope-mobile won't start. What does he do? Or what does his aides do? He doesn't do anything. He declared a new saint. But what does he do? What do his aides do? The Vatican, I believe, has an office of exorcism, because exorcism is a recognized rite of the Roman Catholic Church, driving out demons, performing miracles, in effect. Do they call the office of exorcism to make the car run? No, they call the Vatican, I'm sure, is a big garage. They call the good technician who's going to know how to start the car. Whatever religious function the Pope claims to have, extending in this case to the next world and to this world, it's not going to start the car. He needs a technician. He doesn't care if the technician is a Muslim or a Buddhist or an atheist. He wants the car to move. Now that's a good example, but there's a better example, and you referred to it briefly. You mentioned Hugo Grotius, one of the fathers of international law, 18th century, philosopher, legal jurist in the recently independent Netherlands. He was a very pious Protestant. He wasn't a Calvinist, he was an Arminian, what I call the more humane form of the Dutch Reformation. they don't believe most human beings are predestined to go to hell, which I appreciate. But he was kicked out, actually, of the Netherlands by the Calvinists who were then in charge and took refuge in Germany, which was Lutheran, more tolerant. And he died in Germany. He was not an atheist, but the very famous sentence, I only recently read it, I hadn't known Grotius before, in his basic work on international law. He said, international law should proceed, he had a Latin, he wrote in Latin phrase, as if God did not exist. And he's not an atheist. He just said, international law cannot operate with theological principles. Now, he had no choice. International law, if it were to apply, at least in Europe, you had Protestant states, Catholic states, Lutheran states, Anglican states, Calvinist states. You had the Ottoman Empire within Europe. You had Orthodox Russia within Europe. If international law was going to be applied to all of these countries, it couldn't speak in the name of God, because which God? Our God or your God? He couldn't do anything else. But that notion of, that's a secular space. What he said in my reading, he said international law is to operate in a secular space, whatever your personal beliefs are. But then it extended to other areas of law. And I was thinking of Grotius, thinking of the Netherlands, which, as you know, is a country which rains too much, the whole country is flooded. The newly independent Netherlands had two problems which they had to deal with. One was how to keep Spain from reconquering them, which they don't want because they had the Inquisition and other disagreeable things which the Dutch didn't want. And the other one is to keep the sea from flooding the whole country. Now, they had Protestant regions within the Netherlands, and they had Catholic regions. The south was still is mainly Catholic, the north is mainly Protestant. They had to cooperate. So there had to be a legal system, because these are legal questions, land, property, and things like that couldn't refer to either Catholic or Protestant theology. Now, that's not just the Netherlands in the 17th century, that's the United States today. And when we talked about before, I'm really continuing our conversation without trying to distract from what the other people have said, but you and I I think more interesting for me right now. If you're a federal judge in the United States, Americans are the most litigational people on earth. If there are 3 Americans on a desert island, there'll be 5 lawsuits. They'll all sue each other. So the federal courts right now are constantly burdened with First Amendment cases. Very often to do with contraception. The Obama administration wants to force Catholic nuns to hand out condoms. I'm slightly exaggerating. And the question is, how do you balance the right of these nuns to say, no, we're not going to hand out condoms to the right of women to get abortions. Not abortions, to get a contraception, never mind abortions. It's even more complicated. Does the United States have a common creed? Yes. It certainly has a constitution. But what I want to talk about is not the American Constitution, but the German Constitution, which I find very interesting and relevant, particularly to India right now and to the whole Muslim world. The Constitution of the Federal Republic, which was then West Germany, was promulgated by a Constitutional Assembly in 1949, just shortly after World War II. And unlike the American Constitution, where the Bill of Rights came some years after the main document of the Constitution was written, it comes as amendments. The First Amendment is very interesting. The very first is on freedom of religion, speech, and assembly. In Germany, it's the other way around. Most of the text comes afterwards. The very first sentence of the German Constitution is the rights of man, and man here, any feminists certainly does not exclude women, man in the generic sense, human beings. The dignity of man is inviolate. Doesn't mean it cannot be violated. It should not be violated. It's the absolute first principle. It's what we really ultimately stand for in this assembly. And all the other elements of the German Constitution follow from it. They don't repeat it. And they only mentioned God in the very beginning. They mentioned Christianity as one of the sources of German culture, which is historically correct, but doesn't really mean very much. You kind of appeal to it in a court. Now, what's very interesting is already then there were parties that had a C in their name. Like today, two major parties in Germany are the Christian Democratic Union, to which Chancellor Merkel belongs, and the Christian Social Union, which is a kind of Bavarian adjunct of the CDU. Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union. What does the C mean? There are many people in Germany who say it means nothing. Not just secularists, serious Christians. What do you mean by Christians? Not Christian. Look, the rest of the Constitution, nothing to do with Christianity. You don't even mention God in the Constitution, except in the preamble. When was this written? 1949. And I think I will make the general case in terms of your point. I'm talking mainly about you, but it happens to be most relevant to me at the moment. Don't disparage anyone else here, on the contrary. What we stand for becomes clearest when we come up against what we absolutely refuse to stand for. I think moral insights usually begin with negatives. We are not going to do that ever again, or ever, period. That's exactly what happened in 1949. The Nazi regime, with its horrendous violations of human dignity and human rights, was just a few years ago. And the Soviet Empire, which was not quite as bad as the Nazis, but close, was a few miles away. That we are not that. We break with the Nazi past, and we are not going to go the way of East Germany and become a Soviet satellite with communism as the state doctrine. The people in that assembly, some of them were serious Christians, both Catholics and Protestants. In the German resistance against Nazism, which unfortunately was not very big, but it was significant, and a few thousand people were executed because of opposition to the Nazi regime, the core of it were very religious Protestants and Catholics. Now, what's very interesting is, these people, I'm sure, had a Christian interpretation of that first sentence of the Constitution. In terms of, you know exactly what it would be, in terms of man as the image and the image of God, and the fundamental obligations for anybody, not just Christians, to adhere to certain moral principles. And they, I'm sure, they were very conscious of all this, and they had a Christian rationale for voting for this Constitution. Other people had different rationales. There were agnostics and atheists and all kinds of people who believed now in the new democracy in Germany. They had other reasons for agreeing with this principle. That, I think, is the secret answer to what the problem you very interestingly raised. Yes, you need a moral consensus. Most of sociology, I think, showed this. Emile Durkheim most clearly talked about every society, if it is to survive, needs what they call the collective conscience, to which you can appeal in this fabulous dark red light that you face as a driver. If we didn't have that, there'd be a lot of more people who die on the road. People agree with this, not because there are police around. Very important insight, I think, I would derive from this. Pluralism means that, yes, we have to find certain common values. Otherwise, the society will fall apart, especially in the face of challenge from outside, from other communities. But different people will have different reasons for agreeing to that moral consensus. The moral consensus has to be there. I don't think I have much more time. I could talk about this all night, but maybe if we meet in the next world, we'll talk about that. But we'll know more then. But in Germany, in fact, in Europe in general now, the issue of precisely this issue is radically raised with the presence of Islam. Not just radical Islam, which is a minority of Muslims, and I hope will become a larger minority of Muslims. It's not just people who blow up buildings or kill people in supermarkets. It's people, many millions of people who have found in Islam a guide to life, meaning of life, ordering life for them. What's Islam going to be like in Europe, and how does it relate to the values which the Constitution proclaims? That's an issue, an existential issue, life and death. And the question is exactly that what people who are not Christians mean by this. Angela Merkel apparently is a Christian. has a lot to do, I think, with her position on migrants. A very interesting issue. She now suddenly has come out. She said in an interview, before I make decisions, important decisions, I pray. Interesting. But there are other Germans who are not at all related to either Catholicism or Protestantism, but they have learned these values. They have become part of the political culture of the Federal Republic. Very much as a result of the experiences that have happened during World War II and in the communist world after World War II. So I think the question for sticking with Islam for a moment is, as far as I know, every Muslim majority country, with the exception of, certainly Saudi Arabia or Iran, but some others as well, have a sentence, something like legislation should be based on Islamic principles. What are Islamic principles? It's very much like the sea in Christian parties in Germany or in Europe. It means compassion, concern for the poor, justice, very important. Is that going to be what Islam will be in Egypt? Egypt is very interesting because until the Muslim Brotherhood came to power a few years ago, there was that sentence in the Egyptian constitution, legislation based on Islamic principles, which very liberal people could accept, even agnostics could accept. When the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, they changed the constitution, and it said legislation should be based on, what's the phrase, on Sharia law as interpreted by Sunni jurisprudence. That's very specific. The new government, the military government, we're back now with the Islamic principles. No more Sharia law. And how do you interpret Sharia law? Very interesting. And who's going to win out in what is correctly now called the struggle over the soul of Islam? Is it going to be ISIS or is it going to be Tunisia? Take one good counterexample. Well, I think I should stop now. I hope I've done justice to what you said, and I did not mean to discuss.